Hey, welcome everybody to the February edition of the IO Guru Talks. Oh, that's a mouthful actually. Um, yeah, hopefully everybody is excited and ready to get into some technical stuff. Some pretty cool stuff this month. Container queries, so that's very new. So hopefully everybody's ready to get into that and learn what it's about, where to use it, how to use it, why you should use it. Hopefully, we can get all that information from Maarten van Hoof. And next up after him, we'll be having a beginner's guide to functional programming, which hopefully everybody's on board with now. If you've touched React, actually pretty much anything these days, it's becoming pretty popular. And that'll be by Abbe Keultjes. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Maybe he can correct me later on. We're going to wait a couple of minutes, maybe a minute or two more, to try and get a few more people, or give a few more people some time to join. In the meantime, maybe you can just drop in the comments whether you like the new YouTube live stream. Trying it out this month. Yeah, just trying to improve it, make it more accessible to everybody. So, yeah, if you have any comments or any improvement tips, let us know. Yeah, and I can finally say this. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Yeah, you can see I'm repping the IO merch this month as well. So that's pretty exciting. Really getting into the swing of things now. So this was not a marketing speech. Yeah, just going to wait another maybe 1 or 2 minutes. So, okay. Well, I got the go ahead actually. So it looks like we're going to start now. Yeah, sit back, get a beer or something to drink and eat, and let's see what Maarten has to say. Welcome.
Hello there.
How's it going?
It's
What do you have for us
going
today?
very well today. The sun is shining again after all that wind from last week. So
Finally.
finally.
Yeah. Yeah, looking forward to summer, honestly.
Ooh, me as well.
Yeah. So maybe you can jump us into it, give us a kickstart on container queries and where we should begin.
Kickstart. Oh my god. I'm not going to give you a crash course. I'm going to tell everything about container queries because it's the most awesome
Perfect.
thing coming to CSS.
Okay. Well, I'm excited. You ready?
So I'm ready. Are you ready?
I'm ready. I'm pretty
Okay, let's go.
cool. Let's do this. Let's go.
Let's see if we can pop up my slides. Ooh, yes, this works. Okay, cool. So everybody in the chat, just if you recognize yourself in the following questions, say yes. Have you ever built reusable components? And if you did, how did you ensure that the components were able to have the most optimal layout across different viewport sizes? Did you use media queries, or did you provide configuration options? If my former questions are not ringing any bells, no worries. For the next 25, 30 minutes, I'll share with you how you in the near future can develop robust, reusable, responsive component styles with something that I have been personally been waiting for since I started developing responsive websites and applications. And as my previous slide said it, container queries, which I believe are the next step towards a truly modular CSS. That's my face. I'm double on screen right now. I'm Maarten, and I am a developer advocate and a front ender at that company above. So the ad revenue is coming in really hot today. IO, we're a first full service company, and we are made out of insatiable, curious talents who wants to share everything. Oh, I am coming in. I have technical difficulties. I am very sorry. Why is that? I'm coming in at 1 frame per second. Oh, let me get back. Check. 1, 2. I'm sorry. Everything all right again? Okay, let's continue. I hope the audio still works. Uh, I've been in front end over a decade now, and at IO, I've been part of projects that create design system component libraries. And on a more personal basis, I was even silly enough to maintain my own custom version of Bootstrap. So with having seen that evolution in front end over the last couple of years, I think container queries are one of the most exciting features coming to the CSS standard. And it will enable you to optimize responsive styling for your components. Let me show you an example. Let's say that we're part of a project and our goal is to build this dashboard page. And if we take out of account the header and the sidebar for a second, and we look at the main content of the page, we see a handful of widgets. A weather widget, a pie chart showing our favorite candy bars, a bar graph showing our favorite pies, and a user list widget. And in this project that we are now in together, we have to implement the following requirements. As a user, I should be able to customize my dashboard by resizing widgets, and I want to see less or more information depending on the size of the widget. So, for instance, if we choose to enlarge, or the user chooses to enlarge the weather widget, then he or she could see more information, like the temperatures, the upcoming temperatures of the week, or the expected precipitation at the little bar below with the raindrops in it. Let's think of other possible factors that could come into... Oh, I'm going too fast. Let's think of other possible factors that come into play. Maybe the sidebar is collapsible. So if we collapse that sidebar, again, that weather widget will enlarge. And how would you author your components in a way that that it will always have the final result in other applications, maybe not your own applications, because we are building a design system or a component library? How do you author these components that they will have the final result will be the most optimal one? How would we translate these requirements with the possible side effects that I just mentioned into code? Oh, I'm so sorry for our viewers that the stream is so choppy. Just close your eyes and listen to my voice. Just kidding. Okay, how would we solve these problems? Maybe we could use media queries. Well, media queries, they query the viewport. So if we close the sidebar, our components won't see that if they only use media queries to restyle. Maybe we want to create custom classes and have extra configuration options. For instance, we have the internal dashboard web component, and we have those external widgets with their own types. And then maybe we could add a size property to those web components and say, okay, we have now we have the weather widget large, and now we have the user widget large. Well, in this case, the final application would be responsible for the for having business logic to check, okay, what size is my grid, and is my sidebar collapsed, and we have to build all these extra business logic just to make sure the widget gets to the right configuration. It's not automatically provided for us. We also could use something like the resize observer. what is the resize observer for those who don't know? It's a JavaScript, a web API that enables you to look at the size to observe the size of a widget, of an element when it resizes. Well, okay, we could implement this thing in JavaScript, and every time the widget resizes, we'll set a different class. Pretty straightforward. Cool if you're using a JavaScript framework, but be aware, if we're using JavaScript and we're implementing our JavaScript the right way, which means first CSS, critical CSS, and then the DOM, and then the JavaScript, the style, the correct style of your widget, the final style after the resize observer kicks in, is only visible to the user after the JavaScript is evaluated. So you could have a flash of unstyled content, and that could be not beneficial to the user experience. So what we're looking for is something in CSS, something just like media queries, something that doesn't have a flash of something that enables us to write less JavaScript. Oh, yes, I said it. Well, thanks. I'm sorry. Luckily for us, there's something coming up, and that is container queries. Container queries, element queries, the possibility of querying each element to its own dimensions is something that we've been looking for since modular design, since React and Vue came up, and they met responsive web design. And it has been on the discussion radar for, I think, almost a decade now. I've seen articles go back to 2013 talking about this principle about querying the size of an element itself. And thanks to recent improvements to browser engines, the advent of the CSS containment specification, container queries, which can lead to heavy layout calculations. I think we have lots of components that are looking at their own sizes. It can finally be implemented in a performant way without sacrificing anything of the user experience. With container queries, the component itself owns all of its responsive styling. So container queries are the most optimal solution for responsive component-based architectures, like design systems, like component libraries. And it splits up the responsibilities for the styling of our layout. For example, if we take a look at the dashboard page here again, the larger parts of your web page, like the header and the sidebar and the grid of the dashboard, is responsible. The dashboard will take its own responsibility for that, using grid template columns, grid template rows. You make the grid on the dashboard application page, and depending on the size available, the components within will have their own can declare their own individual styling and be optimized for that. They have their own responsibility. Let's look at an example. So in this example, created by Una Kravitz, shout out to Una, we have a web shop of plants where you can buy plants to spruce up your home office. And we see many plants here, and all those plants are contained within the product class. And we're just using one class together with container queries to optimize the layout depending on where the product is placed within the site. So on the right-hand side, you can see the small products, because they have less space available. No button is visible. No description is visible. In the hero, there's a little more space. So description, we add the description, we add the add to cart button. And if we go further, and we have more space available, yeah, then we put the image on top. Bonus points, if you're using container queries, it's also mobile ready. So if we then make the viewport smaller, there's less space available in the main part of the product, the homepage. Okay, the products will automatically adapt their size, their styling. Container queries are part of the CSS containment module level 3, and the specification is currently in working draft. Remember that? It's working draft. So everything I'm telling you right now is bound to change. Or maybe not that a lot. That's not good English. But it's actively being worked on. It's in discussion at the CSS working group. CSS containment, what does that mean? Well, with CSS containment, we can improve rendering performance by isolating a piece of the DOM in subtree isolation. And it's that thing that enables us to implement container queries. And the syntax is something like this, where you state, okay, I have this class, I have the contain property, and I can use size containment, layout containment, style containment, paint containment. I will not go in that any further. If you want to know about that, just check out CSS containment module level 3 on Google, and the specification is on the working group page. But I will continue with container queries. So the first syntax they thought of was, okay, let's use the containment specification to state size, layout, style. And with this, we can start using container queries. Well, it's not easy to remember, or it's not that straightforward. So working group said, okay, let's use a syntax that's more straightforward. Let's use the container property, in which we can set the name of the container, and in which we can state the type of container. So container is a shorthand for container name, container type. With container name, we can target specific containers, have multiple containers which one class can then query specifically. And with container type, we can state which variables on which the container query should look at. And we have, for instance, inline size, at the logical property of width. We can check out the size, which enables us to look at the aspect ratio of containers towards the orientation, other things, and style. And about style, I'll tell you in a few moments more. So size container features. If we state container type is size, then we could container query our the size of our container. So the container rule is just as simple as the media query rule. It's almost the same as the media query rule. We say at container. We say if our inline size of our container that we're targeting is larger than 400 pixels, do something with the product body. And we can also use multiple container queries. And with container name, just like I said, we can target multiple containers. For instance, we have the product list, we have a page. Product list has a container name of list, page has a container name of folio. And if we put the name between the actual query and the add container characters, we target that specific container. Same goes for the folio named container. One important thing to remember is that containers cannot query themselves. So you always have to set container queries on an ancestor. This example won't work because it's querying itself. That's a very important part of container queries. It's a constraint that we have to work with. So size container features, or let's just go back to our dashboard. How can we implement container queries in our dashboard? Well, if we take each widget and we put a wrapper around it, or put an extra widget body inside of our widget, we then can state the container inline size or property on the widget, and then we can we can query that container with our widget body, and then we could hide and show and do CSS stuff with our widget body. So that were size container features. A second thing they're discussing is, or what the CSS working group is discussing, are style container features. This would allow you to query the computed styles of a container. This example that I'm showing, I'm setting the container type on style, and with the style function or method in the container query, I could query if the background of my container is red and act accordingly. What they're also discussing, but this has been deferred to a later stage, is checking if we could query the state of a container. For instance, our headers, our sticky headers, check if the header is in its sticky state. Again, this was proposed at first, but has been deferred to a later stage just 2 weeks ago. But it's on the radar. Container relative units. This one's coming in this stage is having just like our viewport relative units, having relative units to our container. So having CQW 1% of a container's width, or CQI if you want to use logical properties, have similarities between the viewport relative units on containers. And the very good news is that we can start experimenting today, because Chrome Canary has support behind the flag for container queries. If you enable the enable container queries flag, you can see the first container queries that are where the specification is quite set. That's the word I was looking for. There's also a polyfill available. So Google also made a polyfill available. Although I should warn you not to use this in production yet, because it's a working draft. It's still in active development. So just like I said a few slides back, I had to warn you that this thing has this piece of the specification has been deferred to a later stage. So things are still coming and going. The basis around size is set. The syntax is bound to change. And with a polyfill, remember, it's a JavaScript solution, and JavaScript solutions might lead to flash of unstyled content. I personally would not recommend it to use in production just yet, but to start experimenting with it. And you can also participate in the actual definition of container queries, because the CSS working group discussions are on GitHub. They're open source. They're available for you to watch. That's how I know that the specific parts have changed. Each time I have to give the slides, I'll check that working group out and go through the comments and see what I have to change in my slides. And if you have awesome experiments, if you have thoughts about container queries, you can add them to the awesome container queries repository maintained by Stu Robson. And please do participate, because CSS working group is always looking for voices, for opinions regarding certain features of not only container queries, but other APIs. With that, I've also started experimenting, and I think container queries is a good example for a shopping cart. For example, this shopping cart, we see a big shopping cart in the middle where we all have all our business logic, which does multiplication. But in websites, we also often have small shopping carts. So I used container queries to encapsulate the same business logic within one web component and use that web component as a mini cart. And again, we have the same business logic doing multiplication and division and so on. Another thing I discovered is that with container queries, we can create responsive inline SVG and SVG sprites. So here we have two pictures of two dinosaurs, a Diplodocus and a Stegosaurus. And with the Diplodocus, if I make the frame a little bit smaller, we can see an outline is added, because I stated that with container queries, if you go under this size and viewport gets smaller, use an outline. And the same goes for the Diplodocus, but only with another size. The awesome part of this is it's using SVG sprites. So I only had to define my SVG once in top of my document and then reuse them throughout my whole website. So think what you can do with logos, with icons. Possibilities are infinite. The opportunities are infinite here. So, what did we learn today? Let's wrap it off. Container queries encapsulate adaptive styles within the components. They're the ideal solution for responsive modular front-end architectures. We are not only limited to size, but also they're discussing style, maybe state, and we're getting container relative units. Although, be aware, the specification is still under active development. You could start experimenting today, but I would not recommend it using just yet in production. If you want to experiment with container queries, share them at my Twitter at MRTNVH. I will happily retweet your experiments for you. Go crazy. I want to give credits to the people working in the CSS workroom, especially Miriam Suzanne and Una Kravitz for inspiring me and getting me all hopped up to give this talk to you, and everyone championing container queries. Thank you for your hard work. If you want to know more about me, that's my website, mrtnvh.com. Especially of course, the ad revenue has to come in, and I have to share our careers website at IO Digital. So if you want to work on container queries as soon as the specification hits all major browsers, come work at io.com, because we'll definitely start using those. And one last thank you is to you for watching, and I wish you all a very good night, and yeah. Thanks.
Hey, I'm back. Thanks so much for the chat. The talk was great. Very impressed by your remembrance of the dinosaur names.
I have a young boy who is aiming to be a paleontologist.
Okay.
So I have to remember my dinosaur names very well, or I'll get an uitbrander, like we say in the Netherlands.
Well, at least it keeps you on your toes, right?
Yes.
That's great. No, that was really interesting. I can hear myself. I think it might be on your side, but...
I'm sorry.
No, it's perfectly fine. I don't mind, actually. It's always weird listening to yourself, right? Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you so much. Hopefully everybody else enjoyed it as much as I did. Sorry for the choppy video, not too sure why that's happening. Video seems perfectly fine now, so we'll investigate that for future talks. So our apologies. Yeah, but the talk was great. Content was really interesting. I'm excited to see where it goes. It's always nice watching things develop, right?
Yes.
We're all pretty. I mean, in the front end community, everyone is pretty into like how quickly everything evolves, and it's always like you get this kind of, what's the word for it? Kind of excited buzz around new buzzwords. Maybe that's not.
Yeah. JavaScript framework every day. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what the. No, I'm not even going to make that joke.
No, but I understand what you mean. We're used to seeing getting slapped in the face with new array methods every year, and this has been cooking quite a long time, because in 2013, when this concept was created and talked about within browser vendor, it was not possible because computation was far too high, and they had to invent new things. But with the advent of CSS Grid, and with CSS Grid, Chrome had to do, I think Chrome and Firefox had to revamp their whole layout rendering engine. It gave the possibility to start working on the containment specification. And Miriam Suzanne, I think, saw that, and I was like, hey, we could use container queries here. So
yeah,
it started rolling, and now we almost have it, because it's going to be part of the CSS specification. So things have to be hashed out very, very well, and those things take time.
Yeah, I completely understand that, but I think it's also, as you said, we now have Grid. We're slowly getting more exciting CSS stuff, and CSS, at least in my head, it's something I don't pay that much attention to, and it's possible that it's because it's been stagnant for so long. At least from my perspective, there hasn't been that much change.
Indeed. We 10 years ago we had the advent of HTML5 and CSS3, and then JavaScript took over with ES5, 6, 2017, 18, and so on. And I know I have the same feeling that we're kind of missing out of CSS features, but that's gonna change, because in 2022, what things are looking alive for CSS.
Yeah.
Next week, we have a major new features in all major browsers called CSS Cascade layers, and that's also one of the biggest things in CSS. So I'm really looking forward for this year, CSS wise.
Yeah. Well, you're getting me hyped up, so maybe that's an idea for the next talk. Bring that up. No pressure, though.
No pressure.
We do have a few questions, so I'm not sure. One of the questions was, do you see container queries replacing media queries in the long run? Or will they live peacefully side by side, in your opinion?
That's a great question. Thank you, Alexis. Personally, I think I would rather use container queries everywhere, because I'm in that modular state of mind. But if you're using the viewport, or if you want to query something that is using the viewport, why not use the media query? Because we have to remember, we have to state that containment on the body tag then, or the HTML tag. So if the thing is, querying the viewport, media query, querying something else, something inside the viewport, or I mean, a component, a part of your website, I see container queries are the way to go.
Okay. I don't know if you've convinced me on that one yet, but I'm gonna see. I'll keep a look
it's
at
easy
next...
It's easy to do, because it's just a hype now, and container. Why not use container queries for everything? Well, I'm gonna start carefully and see where I'll shoot myself in the foot first, and then I'm gonna tell you, and then I'll be back to tell you how I shot myself in the foot with container queries next year.
Yeah. Well, the next two questions basically follow up directly onto that. So, how much of the specification do you think will still change?
Not that much.
Okay.
So I think things will be deferred for discussion, but the things I've just shown you around size and mostly size, that's set because people are already starting experimenting with that and have blog posts on it and examples, just like that shopping cart example, and feedbacks. There's feedback for that. Also, I talked to Miriam. Wanted to check out if I'm not saying anything stupid in my presentation, and she convinced me that it's not gonna change that much. But yeah, who knows?
So that's a little bit of insider information to put our minds at ease, I guess. Nice. And the other question you were saying about shooting yourself in the foot in the future. When do you think we can really profit from container queries in production? And I know you said it's not production ready yet, so don't stick it in production. But as you said, like in a year from now, how do you think we can basically profit from using this?
You mean when does it gonna hit all major browsers?
No, but what would the advantage of using container queries over media queries be, basically?
Oh yeah, that's easy. You can if I come from a view, it's easy because I come from a view kind of world. He said it. Oh no. And in Vue, we have the single file component where we can state our template, our script, and our styles, and we can encapsulate the styling within the component. So I'm used to encapsulating styling within the component. So also I want to encapsulate the responsive styling within that single file component.
Okay.
Again, if you're using React and you're using CSS and JS, for example, and you're stating your CSS and JS in the same file, I don't know if they still do that. You want to encapsulate all business logic, but also styling maybe within the one component. And then production is going to benefit very much because the one who is responsible for the component will make sure the component is styled well on all viewports, just like we have the entire website styled well on all viewports. But the components styled well on all available space. So that takes out the overriding component styles in a final application because I'm using my subscription newsletter subscription very large on one place and then the sidebar on another place. So I think it's gonna, if it hits mainstream browser, I think people are going to adapt it, and they know about it. I think people are gonna adapt very fast.
Cool. No, I can see it catching on, but we just need to see how quickly it actually comes to us. But yeah, I'm excited. I hope everybody else is. I don't see any other questions for now. If there's anything anyone else would like to ask, just drop it in the comments, and maybe I'll ask Maarten later.
I'll hang out in the chat. Very excited to hear what Abbe has to say.
Yep. Cool. And one more thing before we get started with Abbe. If there are any video issues, we'll try and maybe disable video for now. We'll look into this for the future and hopefully get this sorted out next time. So apologies in advance if that happens. But yeah, let's get Abbe on and see what he has to show us. Hey.
Hey, good afternoon.
How's it going?
Yeah, it's going well. It's always a bit of there's always a bit of tension just before giving a presentation.
Always, right. I don't think it gets easier. I don't think it will, but you know what? Everyone's excited, so yeah. Let's see how it goes.
Yeah,
I'm sure it's going to go perfectly. Cool.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's my screen. That's great. So, a beginner's guide to functional programming. When I have the option to write functional programming, it's mainly in hobby projects. Unfortunately, it feels amazing to me. I think it's an amazing way to write code, and I feel a bit like an astronaut in space. I feel like I can use the best tools for the job, tools that are perfected over decades, maybe, by brilliant minds. And to me, functional programming is a new promising frontier, even though it's been around since the 70s or 60s or something. But to me, it's very new because I have a different background, and it's begging to be explored. I really like it. But also, like this astronaut in this picture, it also feels very lonely sometimes, because I don't know that many people who also like and know functional programming. So it's hard to share it with my fellow developers, unfortunately. And as we all know, a lot of the techniques used in functional programming aren't used in our day-to-day job. I'm a front-end developer. I currently work for a client with Vue, but mainly the three big front-end frameworks, Vue, React, and Angular, they all more or less support some techniques of functional programming, but not the like the hardcore techniques I'd like to use. So that's unfortunate. And even though it's an amazing thing to work with, it can be very frustrating as well. So this collage also shows how I feel often, because it can be pretty daunting, and especially because there is quite some beginner stuff online, but there's also a lot of hardcore academic material. And they talk, it's a cliche, but they talk about the monads and the bifunctors and all these things. And I still don't know what they really mean. So it's either pretty good blog posts or hardcore. If you want to go further, you have to somehow get through the academic stuff. It's basically like learning a new language, a new programming language. My name is Abbe Keultjes. I work at I/O, just like Maarten, who came before this video. There's my GitHub and my email address. It's with Frontman because I used to work for Frontman, and Frontman got bought or taken over by I/O, and now it's just I/O. But I still have the old email. So I never studied IT. I have a different background. I'm self-taught. I do this for about 15 years now. I'm a professional developer for about 15 years. Like, I think nearly every one of us, I have an OOP, an object-oriented programming background. I think nearly everyone started with that paradigm because it's just the most popular paradigm compared to functional programming. Yeah, and that's it. So that's my background. So I don't have an academic background in math, like a lot of true functional programmers have. So that's also why I try to keep the jargon. I try to not mention any jargon in this presentation, and keep it very practical. And it's also from an object-oriented standpoint. My examples will be more from object-oriented point of view. As I said, I'm a front-end developer, and I really like JavaScript and TypeScript. So all examples are in these languages. So functional programming. In this talk, I'm going to share with you why you should learn it. Why I think it's important to learn. How to start learning it. Where to go after that once you have some basic skills. And I'll end the presentation with some learning resources. So why learn functional programming? I think there are two main reasons. For the first one, I'd like to start with explaining imperative and declarative style. There are different styles of writing code, and imperative style can be described if we try to make a sandwich, as an example. In an imperative style, it would look more or less like this. It has these commands which are very detailed, And as you can see, I haven't written all the commands because it won't fit on my screen. And a declarative version of this would simply be make me a lettuce, tomato, cheese sandwich. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's more or less it's a way to describe the differences between the two styles. If we have a code example, this could be an imperative way to sum an array of numbers. So you start with an array of numbers, of course. You have an intermediate variable that changes, that keeps changing its running state in a for loop. And a declarative example of doing the same thing, of summing the same array, would look more or less like this. We use the reduce method on the array prototype. And I didn't show the add method that's passed in, but I think everyone knows what it should do. It adds two numbers. So an imperative style of programming has a lot of implementation details. It's also very explicit because of this, but it's a bit tedious, I think, sometimes. Declarative style has more abstraction. So you have to know a lot of things that's happening is abstracted away in the reduce and add functionality. Because of this, imperative style programming requires a lot of reading, because there's generally more code. And declarative style programming requires knowledge, because you have to know what reduce and add, in this case, does. And in general, an imperative style of programming is concerned with how things are done, and declarative is what should be done. So, and functional programming is a very declarative way of programming, and it's one of the, for me, it's one of the highlights of it. Another thing that's different in functional programming compared to more popular, maybe, programming ways of programming is shared mutable state. So sharing state is fine. I mean, you have to share state often among units of code. Mutating state is essential. We always mutate state everywhere, but doing them both at the same time, that can be problematic. So in this, it's a very simple example. We have a users array, and both these methods, functions, mutate and use this global users array, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it may not. For example, if users has an empty, the last user function may implicitly depend on the add the users function being called first. So both these functions are dependent on outside scope. This can have unintended effects depending on how complex your application is. But if you have a huge object used by several methods or functions across your code base, that will definitely have unintended effects. Both methods are non-deterministic and unpredictable, therefore, because depending on the state of the users array, whether it has 0 or more users, every time you call add the users or last user, it will have a different outcome. And this makes it harder to test. And functional programming deals with these problems, with this problem, and I'll show you later how. So if you also want to start, or maybe you've already started looking into it, where should you start? Yeah, that's the next question. But first, in theory, a vital part of functional programming are functions. Of course, functions are the main building block in functional programming, but they require three things. they should be assignable to variables, like so. So in this case, the a variable gets assigned this function. They should be passable, if that's a word, to other functions as an argument. So the b function accepts a function, like you see here. This function is passed. And maybe the most important property of functions is that they can be returned from other functions. So in this case, we have a C function that takes a function and returns it. It doesn't do anything with it. It just returns the function it receives. If we call it with a function, that function gets assigned to D, and if we call it, we get what the function does. It's 3. So, and these are fairly simple examples. It's a fairly simple example, but it may take some getting used to. I have added another example to show more. Another example from a function that returns a function. So the E function returns this function. That may not be clear if you're not very familiar with the arrow syntax. And the B, so this function that is returned when E is called, finally does this computation, adds to variables, and returns the result. And you get this kind of a weird syntax. I'll also come back to this later, but it's important to get familiar with this if you want to do functional programming. Okay, so then the next step would be to know what side effects are. Side effects. So I'll show you some examples. Here you see a function that's mutating state outside its own scope. So in the scope in this function is only the name variable that's passed, but it's mutating a property of the user object. Also, accessing state outside its own scope of a function is considered a side effect. So mainly, actually, every time you use the this keyword, you're having a side effect happen. Mutating arguments. So in this case, an object is passed to this function, and you're mutating a property of it. When you access global symbols like console, which is if you're in the browser, it's on the also in Node, I think. It's a global accessible object. When you have a non-deterministic result, so this function returns a different date object each time it's called. The same for math random, for example. And finally, if a function throws an exception or throws an error, actually, it's also considered a side effect. And side effects aren't a bad thing, but they should be made explicit because they can be dangerous, or they can be they change the world more or less. So you want that contained from your business logic. And pure functions are the way to mitigate this in functional programming. They never mutate their parameters. They never mutate what they receive. And each time when they are called with the same input, they return the same output, making them deterministic and, as they call in functional programming, referentially transparent. It means that they can be replaced by the value. So, for example, if I call this function with user A and name B, each time I call the function with user A and name B, I always get the same result. And that referential transparency means I can replace the function by that result that will have exactly the same consequences. Dependency injection. So if you need to access a globally a thing or a function or whatever, a value that's globally accessible, you should not use the global variable, but you should pass the thing it's going to use, in this case a logger. which is a form of dependency injection. And this especially makes it easier to test the function. And like I said before, side effects aren't a bad thing, but so you need them. You need them, else your program won't do anything. But you should move them to the boundary of your program. So the log user and set username functions, they don't have side effects, and the place where you call those functions, the place where maybe your client side place, you need the side effects. You need to somewhere you need to update the user in this case. So that it's better to do that in one single place, explicit contained place, than do it in these functions. And finally, this also makes it possible to have no side effects, or have different side effects depending on the environment you're in. In development, you may want to use console log to log something, and in production you may want to use something that logs it to a backend server or something. And in test, you may want to mock it so that nothing happens, but you can only test that the logger is called. Then on to function composition, a very important thing for a functional program. So let's say we have a function make sandwich, and we have to pass it a bread type, and it returns a sandwich, which is an array of ingredients basically, but let's call it a sandwich. Okay, so let's start with an imperative version of this function. Like I said, it accepts a bread type. It calls a take bread function. It doesn't matter what it does, but it returns the beginning of sandwich, and we add more ingredients, lettuce, tomatoes, cheese, incrementally until the sandwich is ready, and we return the sandwich. To make this more functional, to start using function composition, a first intermediate step would be to compress it or make a one-line statement, which is pretty hard to read, but it's an intermediate step. So it does exactly the same as the imperative version, but we wrapped it on a single line. So you can see it's still take bread is called first, passing bread type, and the result is passed to add lettuce, result add tomatoes, and so on. And then finally we can compose this with pipe. I will explain later what pipe exactly does, but it's basically an assembly line, and we pass in order. That's important. We pass in order the functions that should be called, and then we pass the initial seed value if you want, and we can make this slightly. We can improve this slightly more by using point-free notation, which again is something that should click somehow. It's something that probably requires some practice, but I think it does exactly the same. So you can still call it like this, like you see here. It has exactly the same outcome, but it's very clean, and it just says basically make sandwich. What it does is take bread, add lettuce, add tomatoes, add cheese. It's very descriptive, declarative. So the pipe method. Let's explain what it does, because it's a very common, very much used utility function in functional programming. It's a bit like creating an assembly line. So pipe is not the assembly line itself, but it's like an assembly line factory. It creates an assembly line. So let's get the previous two examples back. So these are like on the previous slide. These are the same. The last two composed versions of the make sandwich function. And I'll make a implementation of pipe in an imperative way, because I think most people will find it easier to understand it. So pipe is a function that takes functions, a list of functions, an array of functions. No, not an array, sorry. It takes functions, then it returns another function that takes a start value, and then inside it loops over the functions, passing the value to each function, and then returning the result, the end result. And like I said, it's an imperative implementation, which is a bit ironic in a presentation about functional programming. But well, I hope it's clear for everyone what it does. On to the next subject, currying. It's the word actually is from Haskell Curry, a guy in the 50s or 60s, I don't know, who has a programming language called after him, Haskell, and a technique, curry, called after him, which is pretty cool. So let's, for example, this is one of the methods that's used in the composition function. So one of the things that adds an ingredient to our sandwich, and all it does is it takes a sandwich, which is a partial sandwich actually, and it returns a new array, new sandwich, with whatever ingredients are there, and it adds a tomato. And we can make this more generic. We can refactor this into an add ingredient function, because we have add tomatoes, add lettuce, and add cheese, and maybe more even if you want. So these three functions all do more or less the same thing, and the only difference is that they add a different ingredient. So we could refactor we could make an add ingredient function like this that takes an ingredient and a sandwich, and just does the same as add tomatoes, but more generic. But how would this work in our pipeline, in our composed function? So this won't work, because pipe wants a bunch of functions, and here we're calling the add ingredient with both our parameters, which will return an array. It will return our sandwich, and pipe wants a function. So this doesn't work. This also doesn't work. We're passing the function here, which is good for pipe. Pipe wants a function, but nothing is calling. Well, basically the pipe itself will, if you can remember, pipe will call the add ingredient with the sandwich it made so far. But it requires, our current function requires two parameters. So this also won't work. What would work is if we can make the add ingredient function like this, like accepting a single, first accepting the ingredient, and then somehow returning another function that accepts the sandwich. And that would look like this. So first we accept an ingredient, and that returns a new function that accepts the sandwich, which has the same, which is basically the same as this. Well, where this is of course a generic ingredient. So this would work, and this is currying. It's so yeah, this would work. It would look like this, making it, I think, it's again very declarative. You can see, you can understand what's happening here. And this is currying. So the currying is converting a function with n arguments into a sequence of n functions that each take one argument. And a sequence of functions, sequence in this case means a function that returns a function that returns a function, as many parameters there are. And function composition often requires curried functions. In Haskell, for example, everything is curried. And also, there's also a JS library I come back to later, where also everything is curried. So currying is very important. So some JS libraries you can start using, because I think it's important to to use a JS library or a library to learn functional programming, because it forces you to think functionally, and reading documentation and reading examples is very, you learn a lot from it. There are basically three popular libraries: Render and Lodash/FP. They both have more or less the same API, so that's why I put them in the same place. They both have immutable functions, so you don't have to worry about mutability. All functions don't mutate their state or whatever you pass to them. They both have overloaded currying or auto currying, which means that the insert function, for example, you can call it with each parameter once. So you can call the function once, or you can call it partially or curried. So this all works. It all automatically works. It's the same effect. But it has shitty TypeScript support. I started using Lambda with TypeScript. There are types, definitely typed, but because the library it's a pretty old library, and it was never built with TypeScript in mind. So it's just, don't do it. Don't use these with TypeScript. Another, I'm not sure if it's popular, but it's interesting at least. Library is Sanctuary. It's a bit stricter than Lambda and Lodash, making it a little bit less easy to start with for beginners. Like I said, everything is curried, so only this version of this function would work. It has no null checks, so it doesn't have it has utilities for not having if statements, and I come back to that later. And also it has shitty TypeScript support, unfortunately, for the same reason. They do have a runtime type checking system, but why? I would say, why bother when you have TypeScript? And fortunately, there are TypeScript alternatives. There are TypeScript libraries as well. So having said all this, what's next? So until now, we discussed some fundamentals of functional programming. That definitely takes some time to get used to, some practice to get used to. Quite a lot of practice in my case. So, and if you got them, if they click, if you think you have a good idea how they work and when to use them, where should you go next? What's next? Like I said before, TypeScript I think is a very good next step, because typing a typed system can be very, very helpful for functional programming. And FBTS seems to be a popular library for this. FBTS, functional programming - TypeScript, I guess it stands for. It has a very extensive documentation. It's also a huge library with a lot of utility functions and stuff, and everything is pretty well documented. There are relatively many tutorials online, and videos and articles about it, more than other libraries. It seems to be gaining some traction. There's a lot of companion libraries. There's a whole ecosystem of libraries that work together with FBTS, basically extending the functionality, which is pretty nice. It contains algebraic data types, which I come back later. And there are also, if you want to take functional programming seriously, I think they are an essential thing to learn. But unfortunately, like it says here in the disclaimer, because you see the site of FBTS here, teaching functional programming is out of scope of this project. And it is, because I can show some examples. You can see here already, you have the applicative and the bifunctor and the bounded lattice, whatever that is, the comonad. You have all these difficult things, contour variant. So let's look for a. This doesn't have one. Let's look for some more. What's the word? There was some more documentation. Reflexive. Yeah. Okay. So reflexivity. Okay. So this. Okay. So here it explains some things. This is pretty good. But okay. So I was hoping to have to show you some examples of difficult difficult jargon, disjoint union. Okay, so take it from me. It does what it says. It doesn't explain functional programming, so it can be pretty daunting to start with this. Okay, but I still think if you want to use TypeScript in combination with functional programming, I think this is the library to go with. So let's first take a step back. The $1 billion mistake. It's something that Tony Hoare coined, and he apparently some time ago invented the null pointer, or the null type, which makes us as developers use null checking. And he said later that it was the $1 billion mistake because it introduced a lot of bugs in code bases. And functional programming has a solution for this mistake. There aren't if statements. So let's get back to our make sandwich function. Let's say, for example, that take bread can now return null if the bread is gone. If there's no bread left, let's say it returns null. Then you would get a runtime error in the add ingredient function. If you're using TypeScript, you would probably get a compile time error as well. But yeah, so that's the problem. We want to solve it. So we can solve it with an if statement, like so. But then we have to more or less break our pipeline. We have to first be more imperative. We have to check if there's no bread. We have to so you have an early return, and then we can if it's not if there's bread, we can continue our pipe. But that's not what we want. We want to do functional programming. So Ramda, one of the JS libraries, has a lot of utility functions. One of them is if else, and it takes a predicate function, which is called with a result of take bread. And if it's nil, if it's null or undefined, you can pass a function what it should do, and else it continues making our sandwich. This I think is a lot better already, but it's basically still null checks. It's basically still an if statement, but then with a function, and it can be there's a better solution, I think. And that's the option type. So this is some TypeScript. The option type is either it's a union type. In this case, it's either a none type or a sum type, a sum of a sum of a certain value. And we can see that there's a function from the option module in FPTS. It converts a value. It lifts a value into an option type. So if we pass in null or undefined, we get a none container. And if we pass a non-null, non-undefined value, we get a sum container. So it can be used for to wrap a value that can be null. And it's called maybe in other languages. Okay, so then I'm going to add a lot of code. I'm sorry for that. First, let's start with flow, because instead of pipe, we're using flow here. And flow is basically the same as pipe, but FPTS calls it flow. FPTS also has a pipe function. It has a different signature. It's out of scope now. So remember that flow is the same as pipe, more or less the same as pipe as we saw before. So our take breadth function may return null, like we said before. We have our from nullable, which lifts the result from take breadth. It's either a none or a sum, and then we use map functions, also from the option module, and map can handle both sum and or non-container. So if map is passed a sum, it will call the add ingredient. It will do its thing, what we expect. And if it's called a none value, non-container, it will just do nothing. But the pipeline isn't broken. And in the end, we want to get our value back. So we want to go from our option type or option none or some container to our value, our sandwich, and we can use get or else. And it either returns our sandwich if it works. If we didn't have any, if we had a sum, and if we had a none, it returns the result of this function. But I think that's a pretty. If we just look at, if we forget how it works for a moment, and we read the code, I think it's pretty, maybe not self-explanatory, but it's declarative at least. Let me take a sip of water. Another well-known or handy feature, handy module in FPTS is the either type, and it's very similar to option. Instead of a none and a sum, it has a left and a right, and normally it can be used for a lot of things, but it's most often used for error handling, where an error or a failure state is put in the left container, and a success state is put in the right container. So we have some utility functions here, a function that throws an error, a function that doesn't throw an error basically, and a function that handles an error. They are very, very basic. And if we pass them to the try catch helper function of either, if we pass the throw error or a function that throws an error, we get a left meaning an error state or failure state with a value. So that's different from the option type. In option, we only had a none, and it doesn't have any value. It's just null, and that's it. There's no value. There's no value in there. And with either, we can also add a value to our failure state. And if we pass a function that doesn't throw an error, we got the right container. Again, a lot of code at once. To apply this either type to our make sandwich function, first we need to wrap our take breadth, which now may throw an error instead of return null. It now may throw an error. We need to wrap it in a helper function. So it should of course still receive the breadth type like the original function does as well, and we use the try catch function to wrap it. So, and the first parameter of try catch is the thing that needs to happen. So take breadth. That's the thing that may throw an error. And if an error is thrown, this function is called. In this case, we just ignore the error and we return a string. So if take breadth throws an error, we have a left container with this value. And if take breadth doesn't throw an error, we have just our sandwich, just whatever take breadth returns. And again, we have a map function. It's a different, because we imported from the either module, it's a different map function. It's an either map, you can say. And again, it knows how to handle left and right containers. And again, we happen to have the same, a get or else function. And in this case, we just the callback we pass. It's getting called in case of a left or in case of a failure state. In this case, we just return the error that we set here. And if our sandwich did get made, will never be called, and it will return our sandwich. So that's it. Finally, some learning resources. There's a website called Awesome FPJS, which has a lot of resources on learning functional programming in JavaScript. There are some dead links, unfortunately, and some things are a bit old, but still, it's a great list. It's a great place to start. Some books I can highly recommend. Functional Light JavaScript from Carl Simpson, who also wrote the You Don't Know JS books, if you know them, and JavaScript Elongay. I never heard of the word before. It's also a really great book about functional programming in JavaScript. And of course, there are many videos on YouTube, but I found that the videos of Scott Vlashin, who is an F# programmer, which is basically C# but then functional. He has a great way of explaining a lot of functional programming concepts. And if you want to see this presentation, the slides for this presentation, you can almost go to my website. It's not there yet because I still have to find a way to convert the slides to my website. But I hope to do that in the coming days. And this is the QR code for this URL. And that's it.
Hey, thanks so much for the talk. It's a lot to take in. I will admit that. But I'm definitely feeling like a sandwich after that. So I think that part got to me the most. Thanks so much. Yeah, we do have a few questions, but I think Maarten has a question for you as well. So maybe if he can get into it first, and then I'll.
Yeah, sure. So I'm taking this opportunity to ask you the question in this virtual room. I was wondering, with all the functional programming, have you already heard of the pipeline operator proposal?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, cool. So it's very. I saw the currying happening, and I thought, whoa, this thing would be awesome for the pipeline operator that's coming into JavaScript.
Yeah.
Maybe this year, maybe next year, we don't know.
Yeah,
But
I get the ES Next newsletter. It's maybe you heard of it.
not on it.
Okay, so it's just one of the many newsletters there are, and I forgot who sent the newsletter, but this guy has some really good articles about, especially new features that are coming to JavaScript. And recently, in a recent newsletter, he had an article about the pipeline operator, and he explained because there are or were two versions.
Yes.
And I think they now chose one.
Yeah, the hack style. So
yeah.
So the people who don't know, the pipeline operator is a pipe and a what is it? An arrow.
Greater than, yeah.
Greater than, and then you can take one function and get the value and hot potato it to the next function, just like you've shown in your functional programming. And with that pipeline operator, if you saw that, do you think you're still in need of your FPTS library?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because of they chose the hack version, or how do you call it, the pipeline. It's the disadvantage of it is that it's less suitable for curried functions. The other version that they didn't choose was very much usable with curried functions.
Okay.
But it's typical for JavaScript, and I understand it. A lot of new features are they need to make a then they they need to. A lot of people don't know certain concepts, of course.
Mhm,
Because a lot
mhm.
of people are new to JavaScript or whatever,
Yeah.
or a different language. So the people of the WC, I don't know if I forgot the group
The
that
ECMA
exactly
working group.
people, they need to decide. They need to find a balance between pure ways of doing things,
Yes.
like they do in different languages, or more familiar ways of doing things.
Yeah.
And they seem
Settled.
to have chosen a more familiar way, which has a disadvantage that it's less suitable for pure, if I
Yeah.
may call it like that, functional programming. So
Okay.
yeah, so I think depending on what you want, I would still recommend to use FPTS, for example.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
You're welcome.
Nice. Still got a few more questions, and it kind of, I guess, links onto what you were saying of recommending basically functional programming. How would you convince colleagues to actually give functional programming a try and basically start using it in a project?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's not. So I think most of us are working for companies, right? Companies that need to make money. And, yeah, the dog agrees, I think. And companies need to make money, and so their code base should work for a lot of programmers, different programmers, because um, if a code base can only be understood by functional programmers or any other specific paradigm, there's already a shortage of people on the market. So a code base should be easy to understand for a broad public of developers. So, and I think that's the main reason I would not suggest using functional programming too much in a code base that's not yours. That's not your code base. But if you're working with people, with developers in your own code base, and you somehow don't worry about having enough people also for the future, and so you have the privilege of working with functional programming in an actual production code base. Yeah, so I hope my presentation helped convince people to start at least learning functional programming, because if you understand, if you see the advantages, and you hopefully don't confuse unfamiliarity with complexity, the advantages are obvious, and functional programming is the way to go, I guess. I hope that answers the question.
It does, but I needed to sneeze. My apologies. Yeah, it does. I guess I enjoy using it. I think I was introduced to it in React initially. And I think it's a little bit more common with React developers. I use Vue now, and most of the time, it's not that I don't see a reason to use it. It's just Vue is kind of well structured, and how do I say it? Straightforward is not the right word. Yes, opinionated, where basically you can jump into a Vue project. And I know functional programming is really nice to use, but in Vue, I just don't feel like it's necessary. So it's definitely something nice to learn, though. It's definitely quite interesting.
Yep.
What order is the best to basically start implementing functional programming? Would you start with components or the integration layer? And this sounds like I'm interrogating you, but it's just interesting to know.
So start with components or the integration layer?
Yeah.
And what do you mean with the integration layer?
Honestly, this was a question sent to me. Okay. So basically, I would say integration layer would probably be something like the APIs, so the middleware or backend. So you basically start changing all the API calls, or would you go with components and then like layout?
Yeah, so I think it very much depends on the framework or library you're currently using. So I think I tried making a Vue 3 app. We're all Vue developers somehow, apparently. I tried making a Vue 3 app with as much functional programming as possible, and very soon with state management, it got difficult because Vue again to make people Vue has a different way of using of managing state than you would do in functional programming. So I think it really depends on the library or framework you're using. And in the front end, 99% of us use one of the three currently big frameworks. And it's probably, like I said, it's hard to use functional programming there. So that I would say that might be easier to use the integration layer. If you, for example, on the back end, you may use something, I don't know, it depends on I assume you're using Node or something, so a JavaScript or TypeScript environment, but you probably won't use Nuxt or any of the server-side rendering types of the front-end frameworks. So you probably have more freedom there, and so probably you can use functional programming concepts there more easily than with components.
Yeah, that makes sense. For instance, with using it with a different state management solution like Pinia, for example, I don't know if you've tried that, but that might make implementing functional programming a little bit easier. I haven't tried it myself, but
I actually tried it, Pinia.
Yeah.
I started with Vuex and then I saw Pinia with Vue 2, whatever. And I actually got it to work quite nicely with lenses, which is or optics, I think it's called in functional programming. It's basically a functional way to mutate nested objects, and but in that case, I was the functional code I was writing with lenses took that did the state management, and the only thing that Pinia did was persist it, basically.
Okay.
So it's not really I got it to work together, but they didn't work together, So
yeah. Okay, interesting. I think one last question, and this was a question from someone in the chat. Basically, what is a monad? So you went over something, and I guess they just didn't understand that. I don't know personally, so maybe explain it all.
Yeah, it's the cliche. I think it's the cliche question in functional programming, of course. I put it out of scope of the presentation because it's jargon, and I don't think it's really important what a monad is, because it's mainly jargon and a lot of theory. And I'm not going to explain it. One, because I can't explain it yet, and two, it's just not relevant.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. It's not an interview, right?
It's just question anyway.
Yeah, it's always good to just share information that you find important. That's what these talks are for. So if something like that is just, as you say, not that useful in context of actually working with something, then that's fine. Yeah, nice. Thank you so much. Thanks both of you for joining. Really interesting stuff.
Thank you. I do, if I could interrupt, I do have one final last question for Abbe, because I'm getting hungry, and with all that talk about sandwiches.
Yeah, right.
If you're making a sandwich with lettuce and cheese, what would you put first, the cheese or the lettuce at the bottom?
Yeah, definitely the lettuce. Else you get this sloppy. If the cheese is and especially if you add some mayonnaise or butter or some or a liquid, it gets sloppy. So definitely the lettuce. Yeah.
All right.
Am I allowed to add my observation to this, that this is a very Dutch discussion? Thanks.
Duly noted.
Yeah. No offense from my side. I just an observation. Yeah, thanks so much for joining. Thank you so much for sharing all the information. It's always nice to have some great talkers, speakers. What's the best way to use that word? Speakers? Knowledge sharers, I guess. Yeah,
Ranters.
hopefully everyone else enjoyed it. And yes, hopefully next month we manage to fix the choppy video issue. Not 100% sure why that happened. We will look into it and make sure everything's a little bit smoother. So yeah, come back next month, see what we have to share. Follow us on our social media to get updates on that beforehand so that you know what's actually coming. And yeah, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and if you hit the bell, you will get a notification for that so you can actually see when we go live, and then you don't have to worry about checking emails and Twitter and LinkedIn, whatever. Yeah, so yeah, thanks for joining, and have a great evening or day wherever you are.